Hello, everyone, and welcome to another important conversation about race, equity, and justice. My name is Jornea Armant. I'm head of Educator Innovation at Flipgrid. And at Flipgrid, our mission is our community's mission to empower every learner on the planet to share their voice and also to respect the diverse voices of others. And for that to truly happen, we have to learn and we have to grow about each other. So I'm so glad to have phenomenal panelists, educators, thought leaders, authors on today. I do want to call them also my friends, because they're my friends first and foremost, because when you make those connections, you also develop friendships. And that's the beauty of learning and growing from other people. So without further ado, we're going to jump in and have everyone introduce themselves. We'll start off with Ms. Yaritza, and we'll continue with Natasha, Keila, and then Ken.
Hey everyone, I'm Yaritza Villalba. I am a high school history teacher at Research and Service High School here in Brooklyn, New York. And I am also the founding president of YV Educational Resources. Oh my God, I almost left out something. I'm also the host of the Flipgrid series, Ask Yaritza, Culturally Responsive Teaching. I'm so excited to be here today.
Hello, everyone. I'm Natasha Rachell. I'm a digital learning specialist joining you from Atlanta, Georgia. And I am one of the co-authors with Ken, wherever down that way, of the Good Trouble lessons on the Minecraft education portal. Super excited to be here with all of you this evening.
My name is Ken, and an advocate for students with special needs, and I am a children's book author. I write both fiction and nonfiction picture books, and my most recent release is Opening the Road, Victor Hugo Green and his Green Book, which we will talk about today. So happy to be here. Thanks.
And I'm Ken Shelton, and I've had the privilege of being a panelist on quite a few conversations. So thank you, Jornea, for the opportunity to share the space with wonderful panelists every single time. Yaritza, I think you and I are practically family now because we've been on several times together, which I got mad about you as well. You know that. And so anyway, for those of you that don't know me, I'm an independent consultant, advisor, strategist, speaker, educator based in Southern California, specifically Los Angeles. And the work that I do is predominantly around organizational culture, anti-bias, anti-racism, educational technology, and culturally competent practices. So it's a privilege to be a part of this conversation as well. And I hope that this will be as fulfilling for those of you in attendance as it is for me as a panelist.
I know it will be. And so we know that February in the United States is celebrated as Black History Month. So I just want to hear from you all about your past and maybe current celebrations of Black History Month from your own experiences, because I remember as a child, I went to a very diverse school. We celebrated. We learned about people in history during that time. That did not always translate over into the curriculum, though, in many other aspects. And then when I was a teacher, I know our teaching staff was very diverse, and we celebrated, we learned, we put on plays, we had students research. There were so many things happening during that month of time, but not everyone has that experience. So what has your experience been when it comes to Black History Month in general?
Who gets to go first?
I know, right?
I guess I'll jump in. So in elementary school, we used to have to recite poems during Black History Month. What was so exciting to me was I was bringing all of this poetry home. For those of you who are new viewers, I was born in Panama. And of course, my parents were just, predominantly Spanish. You say Langston Hughes, my mom is looking at you like, who? And so, being able to share this experience with my family was just mind blowing. And then being able to recite these poems in front of high schoolers while I'm in elementary school was just like, oh, yes, I'm doing this. But I also get exposed to those high schoolers actually, reciting more poems and speeches. As I grew older in the high school and junior high school realm, Black History Month was celebrated. And I think it's because every school that I went to was predominantly Black educators. So that importance of this is what you need to know, this is our culture, was something that, you know, it was in every classroom 365 days. Just that in February, it was just like, bam, if you didn't know what was on this wall, this is what it is. And so I'm very fortunate enough to have been introduced to Black excellence 365 days a year.
So I'm bringing like the opposite of Yaritza's experience. I grew up until third grade, lived in Canada, and then from third grade through 12th grade, Southern California, southeast of where Ken is in Los Angeles. And I had no Black teachers, my K-12 experience. And so Black History Month was Black History Month. And it was 28 days, 29 days in a leap year. You got Dr. Martin Luther King, you might have got a Maya Angelou poem thrown in, and that was it. You might have got a play thrown in there during that month, and that was it. It was not until I left, as a matter of fact, let me back up a little bit. On Twitter a couple of weeks ago, Ken, I know you commented on it because I saw your comment in the tweet thread. There was a gentleman that posted on Twitter a couple of weeks ago that said, how many African-American teachers did you have in your K-12 experience? I had none except for a substitute teacher in fourth grade, one substitute teacher in fourth grade that was there for 2 days. And so that was my experience. It was not until I left high school, moved to Atlanta and went to college at an HBCU. And it was like Black college, like Black History Month every single day for my college experience. And so that's where I got my Black History Month experience, was going to an HBCU. So I had a completely opposite experience from what Yaritza had. So, and I see Ken shaking his head. So I'm curious to see what his thoughts are on that, since he grew up since he's in Southern California as well.
Do you want me to go next, or I can go after Keila? Either way.
I'll go. Actually, I'm older than a dinosaur, so there was no Black History Month. But as a teacher, I recall my turn was to decorate the bulletin board in my hallway, and it happened to be Black History Month. And what I did was I put up a display of Black inventors. Because I thought it was important for kids to see other figures. Not that the students shouldn't learn about the familiar, notable heroes, but that others were making contributions to American history too.
Yeah, and unfortunately, my experience, as Natasha just shared, that was pretty much it. So my entire K-12 schooling experience, I had no teachers that looked like me. And Black History Month was literally just that. And in fact, I'll never forget many of my teachers, especially in high school. It was, okay, we have to stop the curriculum and we're going to spend, and in fact, Natasha, if I may add, you mentioned 28 or 29 days. It's actually more like only 20 days, because think about it, 5 days a week. If we want to really get specific of the details, but ultimately you're right, is the whole idea around, okay, well, we're going to stop the standardized curriculum, which, think about what messaging that is. We're going to stop the standardized curriculum so we can pause, and we got to learn about a few other people. And so because of the timing of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, the month always started off with, well, we're going to do a little bit more about Dr. King, and we want you to, you're going to study the I Have a Dream speech. And of course, they cherry pick certain speech. And then it was Rosa Parks, and then maybe a little sprinkling of Frederick Douglass or George Washington Carver or Booker T. Washington. And that was about it. So for me, most of my robust learning around Black excellence, and by the way, I do want to add that if it wasn't any one of those figures, it was about the enslavement of my ancestors. So it was more around Black death, Black destruction, and Black demise, with a few people that we think were okay. And it wasn't around the excellence. So most of the learning that I engaged in around, and really I even have, as Jornea knows, I have significant family history that's aligned with Black history as well. Most of the learning I did was on the accord of my parents and my grandparents. And so even things of reading like Richard Wright, Langston Hughes was a norm in my home, Yaritza, in my home, but not in school. James Baldwin, one of the I'll never forget really having since Natasha shared it, that we wrote the Good Trouble lessons for Minecraft, not realizing I was getting in good trouble in high school. I remember getting into arguments with my teachers around the fact that, for example, I wanted to study more about Malcolm X, and it was constantly met with the usual marginalization and dismissiveness. Well, no, he was a radical, he was divisive. And if you actually read the autobiography of Malcolm X and you study his life, you recognize that there are ways in which you can be an advocate for your own people without it being at the expense of others. And he went through that whole transformation. I will also add, considering that I think it's important for Black History Month that, and I've shared this with a number of my friends, that the intersectionality of social justice movements and with the recent violence towards Asian Americans, I brought up to a lot of my friends that if you look at the picture of after Malcolm X was assassinated, make special note of who's cradling his head, who was just as much an inspiration and social justice advocate for Asian Americans as he was for Black Americans, and her name is Yuri Kochiyama. Now, I didn't learn about Yuri Kochiyama in high school, of course. I did end up learning about her in college and her life. But the whole idea around that is for us to really start to examine first of all, the history around why is Black History Month in February, which the name is Carter Woodson, and it was primarily because of whose birthdays occurred in the month of February, starting with Frederick Douglass. But really ask yourself, why are we not incorporating these narratives within the curriculum for the whole year? And I always say to educators, if someone or some group needs a special month, then you got to ask yourself, why aren't they included in the curriculum as a norm rather than having this one-off?
Yes. And a perfect transition, Ken, because that is my next question. As we think about, the purpose behind Carter G. Woodson and his push was that we were not reflected at all. So this was a starting point, right? And of course, we had Richard Nixon, who made it so-called official as February being Black History Month in the United States of America. But I do believe that there's some damage that occurs when we limit the information that students have access to. So as you mentioned, and maybe the extent was Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, maybe Jackie Robinson or Frederick Douglass, but what about so many other people? And so my question to you all, just thinking about that, what has been the effect of not incorporating Black history or having the lack of representation or misrepresentation throughout the school curriculum? And what's needed for that to change?
I'll go first on that one. I think the gap in knowledge is real. And I think not giving credit where credit is due feeds into stereotypes that one group of people must be more superior than another. When studying harsh history, I think it's important to have kids question and learn the backstory and learn that there's more than one point of view.
Good point.
I'll add to Keila. So many thoughts. I'm sitting here like writing notes as everybody's talking. As a former high school science teacher, I just think it's so important and even to what Keila was saying earlier, that we're exposing our students to people that look like them, to give them the opportunity to see people that look like them in professions so that they can aspire to be getting tongue-tied. See people that look like them in professions so that they can aspire to be in those professions, those STEM-related professions. For example, I'm speaking from a science teacher perspective. And just to throw a resource out there, there's a resource called IamAScientist.info, I believe, that creates free resources for teachers, these huge, beautiful posters of resources, tons of resources and posters of people, scientists, and every science profession that look like our students, so that students, when teachers hang these up in their classroom, students can see people that look like them. So that exposure is huge. There was an article floating around, I believe it was the state of Utah, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, that said Black History Month, it being taught in schools, is going to be optional. They came back, I believe, and retracted that. So that was like crazy that that was even an option for students to have that as an option to get Black History Month being like information being taught to them, which is crazy to me in the year 2021. Crazy isn't even the word. It was like disgusted. I think that was the word that I used as I wrote about that on social media. Just even me not being taught about Black History Month and about important people in Black history growing up as an adult has forced me. I mean, you see all of my books behind me, and being exposed to people that I'm on this panel on and just my friends that are just, you know, full of knowledge, forces you as an adult to just constantly be researching and researching and researching. And we're constantly growing and researching and evolving anyway, but you just thirst for this knowledge. And it's so disheartening that we don't get that in school. Our friend Andy, who is in the Microsoft educator community, he posted a picture on Twitter a few weeks ago. He had his class in the Good Trouble lessons, and he had the image of his students from behind, and John Lewis was up on the screen. And I just absolutely loved, I believe there was one little girl of color in his class, and I just thought, if he was not a teacher advocating for teaching these lessons in his class, what would her experience be like if all of, and I don't know what the situation is, but I just thank God for teachers like Andy that make it a priority to expose his kids to these lessons, these types of lessons.
So I'll answer the second part of the question first, and then I'll head back to the first part. At our school currently, every classroom, it's almost like you're walking through a museum. Since I teach U.S. history, my classroom is almost like the African-American Smithsonian. It begins in 1619 and it ends obviously with the presidency of Obama. We have it where a science class, it's literally just focuses on Black astronauts. We have another math class where it has in the center of the classroom a pyramid. Our global history class literally has everything from South Africa in it. And the idea behind this is you're exposing students to their history and you're allowing students to see it firsthand. What's important about that is students are able to ask questions, and that's exactly what we want. We want students to be able to say, hey, what's that? Or why do you have that in your classroom? As opposed to just having a framed picture of MLK and say, well, this is a person that you should obviously look up to. What happens when we don't expose students to those things is that, you know, we're doing a disservice. I don't know how it feels to sit in a classroom and not feel included because, like I said, I've had the experience where I only had one Caucasian teacher my entire life, and that was in kindergarten. Other than that, I had Black teachers. I studied Africana studies in undergrad. I had Black professors who took this very serious. And so my experience was a bit different than most, but my students' experiences are far opposite, and they've had African-American and Black teachers and teachers of color that are not exposing them to the importance of understanding who you are. When we don't teach history and we don't teach it through a critical lens, our students are not able to connect with what we're teaching.
I guess I'll just round it out. I mean, just to kind of augment what everyone else has shared. In a recent episode of the podcast that I do with my close friend Dee Lanier, we actually examined this with the former North Carolina Teacher of the Year, James Ford. And the whole idea was, it was in two distinct areas. It was truth, and then the metaphorical mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. And so, first of all, the whole idea around acknowledging and reconciling with things of the past and the way we go through historical study is, my whole thing is that how much of it are half truths, which are no better than full lies. And when you limit or distill an entire group of peoples down to a singular month and a singular few individuals, it does the damage of the following. It doesn't provide a student like me with the opportunity to engage in the curriculum and the learning of the content as a mirror. I can see myself reflected in the content. I can see those that preceded me. I can see what my ancestral excellence is. And then it doesn't provide a window for students that don't look like me to see those very same things, to see that excellence has been demonstrated or actualized by people that don't look like you, that to the point that Natasha made, I remember seeing that where some of the families wanted to be able to opt out of Black History Month. And of course, my first thought was, okay, well, then why can't I opt out of white history, which is the entire curriculum? And further to that point is what I would have challenged the families on is, if you want to opt out of Black history, then you cannot interact with or consume anything that is a result of a Black invention. And the first thing there would be something like, which I'm sure Natasha already knows this, is the inventor of what is our modern day GPS system. So that's one, and I have a whole list, but the whole idea around that is to really provide a comprehensive critical lens on, and I would even say it's aligned with part of the 5 distinct areas of a critical pedagogy, is a critical lens on looking at the contributions of others that don't share the same cultural identity as you, to be able to interact with the curriculum, the content, and the narratives in a meaningful way that allows you to make direct connections if it serves as a mirror, and indirect connections if it serves as a window, because otherwise it provides a false narrative. It provides a false narrative around the limitations of those of us that identify as Black, our racial identity is Black, and it provides a limited narrative as far as exceptionalism for those that are not.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So now that we're all together, all of those ideas spot on. And you guys know I'm a mom. I have been reading these books to my little girls at night for a couple years now. The author is Vashti Harrison. And what's super neat about this is that she not only writes biographies about people who we may have heard of, but there were lots of people who I'm learning right alongside my children. So as adults too, we are constantly in a learning phase. About maybe 3 to 4 years ago, I'm sitting and watching Ken Shelton's keynote, and he mentions the story of his grandfather and other relatives, and I had no knowledge of the Green Book. Then I met author Keila Dawson, who also is a contributing author to No Voice Too Small. And she shared with me that she wrote a book called Opening the Road, which was all about the man who created the Green Book and the purpose behind it. So this story is so beautiful. First, I want Ken, if you can share just a little bit of your story, your family story, and Keila, share the process that you went to learn more about Victor and why he created this Green Book. And then I would love to hear Yaritza and Natasha, if you had the same experience or different experience than me, because I had no clue what it was until I was 36 years old. All right, so here we go.
So you just touched on one thing before I go into the family story, is think about how empowering and liberating it was for you to learn in the context of our interaction. Granted, we're friends, but I had it obviously in my keynote. Think about how empowering and liberating it was for you to learn something that you're not going to find in the curriculum. And so for everyone here, so the whole idea, the whole catalyst around that story was twofold. One, it's included in one of my keynotes, and the other part was the timing of the movie of the same name. And so I bring it up in the context of the following. So I've asked in workshops, I asked a group of folks, how many of them have seen the movie? And a certain number of hands went up. I'd say probably about 75 to 80% of the room. They'd seen the movie. I said, okay, well, how many of you know what the Green Books actually were? One hand went up. And the whole idea around that was the following. I said, okay, well, let me explain something to you, that why we have to be mindful of the media that we consume, the narratives that get perpetuated, and really the whole idea around these what I would say, these limited or skewed stories that are told. So my paternal grandparents used the actual Green Books. And the whole idea around that was the fact that my paternal grandfather, his family, they grew up in Columbus, Ohio. And my paternal grandmother was from Camden, Alabama. So I have family from both Leeds and Camden, Alabama. And when my father and his brothers were growing up, they would drive literally from Columbus, Ohio down to Alabama. And part of what I shared with Jornea was this whole idea around, one, the movie is a perpetuation of a white savior trope, okay, because it's called white racial reconciliation. The main character is a bad racist person, and then through the exploration and at the emotional labor and capital of the Black character, they become a not racist person at the end, because racism is the individual, not systemic, and therefore they're a better person as a result of that. And so one of the things I also asked that group was, how many of you know the story of Dr. Don Shirley? And of course, no hands went up. And I said, then you've been the victim of a colonized curriculum. And I go, this is another reason why Black history should not be limited to one single month, because they hadn't heard of that. And then I proceeded to engage in dialogue around the Harlem Renaissance, among many other things. But the whole idea was that my dad would tell me all kinds of stories of driving in the car for a long time and eating fried chicken out of a shoebox. And it didn't click until later, where I finally asked him, I'm like, why were y'all eating fried chicken out of a shoebox? He's like, well, because we'd be driving for 10 to 12 hours. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, why were you doing that? And the whole idea was that they had to use those green books because there are certain roads you could drive on, there are certain restaurants you could eat at, there are certain gas stations you could stop at. And in some cases, they would have to drive for a solid 8 to 10 hours because it couldn't stop, because it wasn't safe. And so therefore, what my grandmother would do is she would make a large batch of fried chicken, put in a shoebox, and my dad and his brother, they would each get a shoebox, and this is your food, and you better make it count for the next 10 hours. And so the whole idea around that is understanding that these are not, especially if you look at the movie, this is not just something that like, oh, there were these green books, and by the way, this guy's bad, and by the way, there was a musician, but what's more important is this guy was bad and became good. It's the whole idea that one, these books were necessary for survival and to be able to travel. And then I'll let Keila share more about her book, because the whole catalyst for Victor Green even creating these books is a whole nother narrative that I think is important for us to learn and understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'd like to preface with an idea about change. I think adults need to do the same thing we ask of children. We need to read widely, ask questions, and then find those reputable sources to find the answers to those questions. And I think for me, I am relearning what I didn't learn. Children are learning, and I am relearning, because there was so much information that was omitted from my education, and that I just didn't learn. And before I talk about the Green Book, Jornea, I want to share. Have you seen these books? A kid's book about? These are great books. They're not picture books per se, but they are conversational books, and they are excellent, I think, where an adult can learn and then have conversations with their children about the hard topics that they address. And I didn't know about the Green Book. I listened to a broadcast by a gentleman named Alvin Hall, who actually has a podcast now on Macmillan. And he actually has journeyed across the nation and talks to people who actually use the Green Book. And when I heard the story, I thought, oh my goodness, why don't I know about his accomplishments? Why is this story not one that has been addressed in my children's curriculum? Sure, not mine, but in my children's curriculum, or that it's not widely known. And then the Green Book movie came out. I had started my book and my research before the movie came out. And then when that story came out, at first I was excited and I didn't want to watch it because I didn't want it to influence my research. But then I did see it and I thought, oh my gosh, this movie is called The Green Book, and it's not even about the man who wrote the Green Book or the reason for writing the Green Book. So I made sure that when I wrote my story, that I researched all the reasons, the cause for and the need for writing the book. And I made sure that I wanted children to see that these were historical events that were causes, and also that there were solutions that Victor found. And those solutions always had a roadblock. So what a great way to develop socio-emotional learning with children by giving them a chance to read a story about a man who actually went above and beyond. He was a postal worker, and he worked when he was collecting his research and writing this book. So this was something he did at night and on the weekends. He didn't do it alone. He had an entire network of people who he relied on, and it was his community of postal workers, his community in Harlem where he lived, and also females. His wife was actually instrumental in helping with the book. Of course, it was the 30s and 40s, so she wasn't given the credit that she was due either. But I made sure to give her credit in the book. There was barrier after barrier that he went up against. So in a lot of nonfiction narratives, you have characters that fail. Victor just hit a roadblock and then found another solution. Hit a roadblock, found another solution. And I like to say he just kept going.
Absolutely. And, Keila, I think this book is incredible. I've read the book, and there's so many awesome resources throughout the book. But as I mentioned before, just as you said, you had to relearn something that you had no idea, right? And as an elementary teacher, I always would tell my students, you see, you hear something, then you should start thinking, and then you should wonder, right? That's that learning process to kind of get us going, right? And that's what you did, to research, to find out more, and then you're educating other people within this book. But as you all were speaking, and Ken actually shared his experience that he had family in Alabama, but they had family in Ohio, I believe. Thinking about my experience, my family's in New Orleans, Louisiana, and that's pretty much all where we are. So probably in my experience, I didn't have any firsthand knowledge from people in my family because maybe they did not travel because they didn't have the reason to travel, right? And maybe that's why I hadn't heard about it, but that shouldn't mean these stories should not be told, right? I'm curious, Natasha and Yaritza, have you heard of the Green Books before this time or before the movie came out?
So I had heard of them, but never heard of didn't have extensive knowledge or had done extensive research on it until after I heard Ken's keynote, to be honest. I was sitting here, I just added Keila's book to my Amazon cart as she was talking, so it's in there. That's what I was over there doing. And as I was just listening to Ken's story about the drive with the chicken and the shoe boxes, I just finished reading last night. It's over on this stack of books over here. John Lewis's, he has a series of books called March 1, March 2, and March 3. And I can go grab it if you need me to hold it up. But he tells the story of growing up in Alabama and how he, that's all he knew. They lived on this big area of land and that's all they knew. And it wasn't until his uncle came, and I just literally learned this last night. It wasn't until his uncle came, picked him up and drove him from Alabama, I believe, to New Jersey, and was in that car ride for 13 to 14 hours with food. They couldn't stop. And the whole thing, exactly what Ken just described. And it was that whole experience of just driving nonstop. And he tells a story of getting to New York and New Jersey and riding an elevator for the first time and just having those experiences and seeing the big city and the bright lights and not just because he had never traveled outside of where he grew up. And so it wasn't until, again, being grown and doing research on my own that I, was able to learn more.
Absolutely.
Honestly, Jornea, I am just like you. I haven't heard about the Green Books or, these travel guides that was published during segregation until my late 20s. Never did I think, and as a historian, sometimes we get so caught up with my kids have to know this, and I need to push this out, that you don't take the time out to make connections sometimes that you would think that you would make on your own. And honestly, having family that lives in Brooklyn, my family doesn't leave Brooklyn. The only time we leave is to go to Panama. So I don't have any other siblings in the South. My mom only travels from Brooklyn to Panama. Same with my sister. And so everything that I learn it on my own, or I've learned it through professors. And so, like, I always tell people, every time I'm doing a panel discussion with Ken, I'm always learning something new. But in regards to the green books, I didn't learn it until my late 20s. And you would think that as an Africana Studies major, this is something that would be pushed into, you know, me understanding it. And even as an education minor, you would think, hey, as a history teacher, and you're going to be a history teacher, this is what you should know. And this is what you should tell your students. Because if we even make the connection to today, my students, there's certain neighborhoods they can't go in. And so that correlation or that connection too with, we have our own green books, you know, and it's the modern day green books. You know, you can't go into certain neighborhoods. I know what blocks not to walk on, especially in Bed-Stuy. And so it's just making that connection for our students. This is culturally responsive teaching right here.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, I, before I started working for Flipgrid, I used to do this session called Flip Learning Inside Out. And it was all about using Flipgrid, but really to start off with the student, and for the student to put out either their passions, their questions to drive their learning, right? And so I think what's happening right here for me is that I had a firsthand experience with Ken, and being interested in knowing something that I didn't know beforehand. And now I have more information from Keila, and now she has this incredible book. And I do want to pop into the Discovery Library really quickly so that we can talk about something that Keila mentions in the book that I had a connection with, called Sundown Towns. So when I was working in Alabama, I had to really kind of go to 12 different school districts in different areas. And there were some areas people would tell me, hey, you better, you know, watch out. And I'm like, what do I need to watch out for, right? Like, I had no idea. And it wasn't until I went to Keila's book, and let me see if I can get this right, Keila, because we made an awesome collection for educators with the topics that you've created. And one of those topics was sundown towns. Now, what was really interesting for me was that I was able to go to a website and click on a certain state, and I was able to see the sundown towns, in which some towns are still sundown towns, right? And so, you know, once again, I think for our students, we have to open ourselves up to be vulnerable, to share about the things that we don't know, the things that we're still learning, because of course things were so-called hidden from us for a reason, right? I truly believe that. So Keila, talk to us a little bit about the topics that you've created to go along with these books that educators can really take throughout their curriculum, 365 days out the year, and not just be confined to February and learning about this.
Well, I talk about the first topic. I talk about the history and power of story. I like storytelling because it allows students to be drawn into the details. And in picture book and nonfiction writing, you have to have a lot of detail. You know, there's a problem, there's a goal, there's conflict. It mirrors real life. And I think that's what makes it compelling. The first prompt I have is, what are some social problems you'd like to see changed today? And I'm certain that kids will come up with all kinds of ideas. We've had incredible response, like to No Voice Too Small, where we have all these young change makers who are solving problems for, you know, in their lives and in the lives of their communities. I also have building background knowledge. There's a lot of complex concepts, I think, in the book that needed to be addressed. So I wanted kids to understand the vocabulary that you need in order to address the book. So I have some building background knowledge, and I also have some activities around the vocabulary. One of the things that I really wanted kids to see are examples. Just like you guys are sharing personal examples, they need to see people who actually use the book. And there are some phenomenal videos that are online and at YouTube, where you have elders who are talking about their experiences. Like this, one man talks about how he never understood why his father was so unwilling to buy gas at any other gas station but an Esso gas station. And when he learned, it was because the Green Book was sold at Esso gas stations, and they actually had African-American owners of those gas stations. Did it click? Oh, he's a loyal customer. Another video talks about how you never paid with a $20 bill. And it's like, well, what is that? They said, because if you went to a gas station that was white owned, they didn't give you change. So these are all, it's just an amazing, information that you can get. And it's not just from a book. These are from people, real people. They're testimonials. And one of the other things I have in my educator's guide that I wrote for the book is, don't only talk to a Black person who may have, talk to white people too. What did they know? What did they see? What did they do? And you'll learn a lot, from that perspective too. And then one of the final activities I have is Aliane Harris is the illustrator, and I wrote the timeline for the book, but she came up with an amazing idea to make the timeline like a road. So all of those events that are in the book, that those events that happened during Victor Green's lifetime are all connected. And they give the cause and effect of segregation. And one of the activities that I ask children to do is make your own timeline. What has happened in your lifetime today? What events can you think about that have happened today, and make that connection from the past to the present, and then plan for a better future.
Awesome. Thank you, Keila, for sharing. And for anyone interested, we do have these topics available. Here is the short link that you can access these topics with. Let me go ahead and stop sharing my screen so we can see everyone. But one thing that just popped into my mind as you were speaking about that timeline, that timeline is of maybe some events that educators have talked to their students about. So, for example, 1925, Henry Ford's assembly line production, lowers the cost of Model T. Why aren't we talking about everything else that happened at that point in time? What were the roles of African Americans in that point in time as well, right? And so I think that's the piece that I'm making the connection with. That's how we can bring that into the curriculum, right? So if that's in your curriculum, how else can you expand your curriculum to have various viewpoints, various roles of different people who might have had an impact, not just Henry Ford, but I'm sure there's so many others who made that happen, right? So let's go on to some other resources. I know our friends Ken Shelton and Natasha Rachell partnered up with Minecraft recently. And so I'm going back to our Flipgrid Discovery Library right now so that I can share my screen. But Natasha, share with us a little bit about the Good Trouble lessons that you all wrote.
Yes, so we are so excited. I get like warm fuzzies every time we talk about it. Myself and Ken Shelton and Felisa Ford created a total of 10 lessons, but 7 that focus around good trouble with John Lewis. I went and grabbed the March book too. This is what it looks like. But with John Lewis being like your tour guide throughout this good trouble world, and Ken, definitely jump in, and because I know you're like super passionate about it too. John Lewis is your tour guide through good trouble, and it's all about equity and social justice. But it's all focused in Minecraft. Your students will interact with Nelson Mandela and Malala and Dr. Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and Gandhi and Emmeline Pankhurst, all these people that stood up for good trouble, people that regular people, right? Like me and you, that stood up one day and said, enough is enough. I want to make a change and stand up for what's right and make a change, be a catalyst for positive change. And so we created these in-depth, I have to brag, they are phenomenal lessons that a teacher, we were super intentional that a teacher in rural, like Nebraska or rural Oklahoma that may not be familiar with the Black Lives Matter movement or the civil rights movement could take these lessons and have everything they needed, information from videos to resource links to vocabulary to teaching tolerance resources, tons and tons of resources that you could take these resources, these lesson plans, and teach this content to your students, have them explore these resources, and then set them free in Minecraft to explore these worlds. The creators at Minecraft did a phenomenal job at creating, I mean, it looks like real life. They created the Black Lives Matter protests with the signs. They recreated the Edmund Pettus Bridge. They recreated the Woolworths lunch counter. They recreated, oh my goodness, India. And I mean, we all cried. We all got like super teary-eyed just seeing it all come to life. But they are there for you. There's lessons in identity that I know Ken is gonna like talk more about. But we're just so excited to get these in the hands of our students. It is the #1 most downloaded world in Minecraft. So we're super excited. And the other thing I just want to point out, if your students don't have access to Minecraft for some reason, you can still incorporate these lessons. There are tons of external resources that your students can engage in. For example, we've given resources for like Flipgrids and Bunsies and different other resources that your students can engage in, still focused around the topics that we've created. Ken, talk about identity. I'm so excited.
Well, you captured everything brilliantly. I think for everyone who's watching or who watches a recording, I think the important, to add to what Natasha just shared, I think the important thing is that this is a way to engage in the curriculum that is not part of a colonized classroom and is not part of anything that's standardized. If you're in a situation where someone wants to know, well, what's the standard? All of the lessons are multidisciplinary, and then there's no one identifiable standard. It's across a wide swath of whatever standards may exist. And it really points to the whole idea of I would say, the perfect positives around a type of gaming environment, an immersive learning environment, and then again, learning narratives in a way of which you are actively engaged and invested in your experience because you're a part of the experience. And one of the things that the three of us ensured in the designs of those lessons is that it involves interactivity with all of the features of Minecraft, where you're literally building artifacts that ideally an educator will utilize that as a type of assessment rather than going to something that's multiple choice or something like that. So we do have those lessons. We did Natasha. There was one other that you didn't mention. I think is great. Is the one we did with the hour of code on bias and inclusion with the illagers and the villagers. And while it was for an hour of code, I think it's a useful lesson. Period. It doesn't have to be that 1 hour one time a year. But for everyone here, the whole idea around what we did, and then really in the context of of us being as a panel here is that you are now learning about things that you may not have been exposed to in your schooling experience or may not be part of your curriculum at the moment. And think about, I mean, you look at the reaction of all of us here, and hopefully you all will have that same reaction when you go to the Flipgrid library, when you get Keila's book, when you go to the Minecraft stuff. It does something. I don't know what the word is, but I do know that it serves as I would identify it as a cognitive catalyst, which means that we are now thinking about this in a different capacity that serves as a catalyst for us to dive more deeply into that learning experience. And wouldn't we want that with all of our students? Wouldn't you want it to where you expose students to something that is the introduction to something, and while you have learning outcomes that you expect out of it, the students will then begin to take ownership of their learning and say, okay, I know what you're looking for, but I want to go down this rabbit hole or this rabbit hole or this rabbit hole because I want to learn more. And it serves as a type of, that's why I guess, Jornea, you put it in the chat. That's why it's the name of the podcast I do with the Liberated Educator. It's a type of liberation when you have the empowerment to say, I'm learning something that is meaningful to me or that I haven't been exposed to. And now I have a mechanism to go even more deeply into that, think more critically about it, connect it to my own life, if you will, and do it in a way that serves as exposure to, again, to experiences that would not necessarily be a part of a colonized curriculum.
Absolutely. And Ken, since you're speaking right now, in addition to the Minecraft lessons, you partnered with Microsoft to create this incredible anti-racism journey for educators with students. So educators, this is available for you for free on the Microsoft Educator community, where you can go in and go on this learning path. There's lessons that you can do with yourself and other educators to explore your thoughts, to challenge maybe some of your thoughts, and also some ideas for your students. So Ken, just share with us just a little bit about what this learning path might be able to do maybe for some educators who are looking to just kind of change that narrative.
So yeah, that was a really soul-filling activity, endeavor, and creation. So shout out to Megan, Keith, Anu, Dr. Brady, Chris, one of your team members, Chris Matthew. We all work together on creating a learning path opportunity for educators on how to begin the work. A lot of feedback that I've gotten from educators, especially when it comes to racial justice and engaging in dialogue around institutionalized racism, around bias, around things that people identify as uncomfortable, which I always share with folks. Don't look at it as uncomfortable, look at it as necessary. What this is a guide to help support your personalized growth in understanding who you are and how you operate within many of these systems and structures. And then through your own learning, your own personalized liberation, the next step is how might you engage in meaningful dialogue and learning support of students. Now, the first step is to be able to do it yourself before you can do it for others. And so that's what this is. It takes you through a very definitive process. I know that there are elements of social and emotional learning to it. There's restorative justice components to it. Obviously, it uses technology in varying ways. There's access to a lot of external resources that we put together. But once you engage in that learning path, by the time you get to the other side of that learning path, you will for sure be a better version of yourself. But more importantly, you will be in a position to engage in the dialogue, be able to operate from a degree of both humility and love. Humility for recognition that these are things that you may not have known, and that learning is continuous, ongoing, and lifelong. And then love in that you can have love for yourself, in that I now have a better understanding of who I am as an individual and what my role might be as an educator. And then in turn, love for your students, in that you provide them access and opportunity to engage in this dialogue so they don't become the adults that we are, where we are reticent to engage in the dialogue.
Absolutely. And educators, I know you are interested and excited about this work. And if you do not want to go through this alone, I will be facilitating this learning path. So we'll have a professional learning community. This will be launched during the month of March, where we can come together and learn together and grow together in this work. And I want to share, Yaritza, we talk about culturally responsive teaching and pedagogy all of the time. And I want everyone to be aware of the incredible topics that you have created. So if anyone is new to all of this, Ask Yaritza is a series, and she has a feature collection. So Yaritza, speak a little bit about the topics centered around culturally responsive teaching that educators can use and take back into their classrooms. There's 44 in there, guys.
Wow.
The topics are basically centered on my students and who they are. And I tried my best not to just think of what'd be fun, but what connects my students to the world around them. So yes, it's 44 topics, but just think of it as I didn't create all the topics the same day. It's more of these are discussions that I'm having in my classroom. Just like Jornea says, if you could think it, you could Flipgrid it. And so that's exactly what I did. These past 2 months, I actually taught a culturally responsive teaching cohort with Flipgrid. And my whole idea behind that was just like, yes, teachers could talk the talk, but we could also walk the walk. I was just tired of just saying, hey, you can do this. And I wanted to show teachers exactly how they could do it, but also engage with them more in a way where it's like, hey, you tried this in your classroom. Did it work? Did it not work? What can we change? Because not every classroom looks the same. So I could create something that's tailored just for my students. But you may be in India or Indonesia and you have a totally different set of students. And that's exactly what was the reason behind the culturally responsive cohort. We had teachers from Japan. We had educators from India. We had educators from Russia who were up at 5 a.m. To engage in a cohort. And the blessing behind it is we got to engage in conversations that I know they were unable to ask the administrators. So it was real talk about racism and about, how do you tackle when students are using, racist or vulgarity in classrooms? How do you tackle that as a white teacher? What does it look like? What are things you should say? What are things you shouldn't say? And so with this culturally responsive teaching opportunity with Flipgrid, it really enhanced my thinking, but also as it was enhancing my thinking, it allowed me to change my classroom and engage my students in a more critical, deep way of just saying, hey, this is the world that we live in, and this is what we can do to not only become better citizens, but just to be ourselves at this point.
Absolutely. And I encourage everyone, this Celebrating Black History collection with topics from educators as well as partners. Use this throughout your curriculum, 365 days out of the year. Each one of them has a subject area associated with it that can help you determine maybe where it's best fit, or just have your students explore. I love just exploration, put some things out there for students based upon their interests. Have them maybe share some things that they have experienced in their own lives or their families have experienced. I know Yaritza has a topic for families to really get involved. That's one way that you can do this in a culturally responsive way. So guys, that time has gone by so quickly. Every time we have a conversation, I'm like, where did the hour go? So within our last 2 minutes, last words, any advice, last parting words and advice for educators for this moment in time? Of course, we're going to pick back up in April. April 20th will be our next conversation about race, equity, and justice. And I'm so excited. I don't know if you heard of B. Mike Odoms, but he did the latest Colin Kaepernick, I guess it's graffiti art on the Ben & Jerry's ice cream. He has agreed to be a part of our conversation next time. So I am super excited to see where this conversation is going to go, because he's doing incredible things within the community to inspire students, but to also pay homage to the past. So last words from our panelists.
I'm going to leave you, because I am now a fan of Keila. I'm going to leave you with Keila's words that I have already tweeted out, and I'm putting on a Post-it note to put on my computer. She said to do what we ask of our students: read widely, ask questions, and find reputable sources. I am a fan. I'm here. Yes.
And as a writer, I would like to ask teachers to look at your bookshelves and make sure that the books that you have are accurate reflections, because too often books may be old and have inaccurate or insensitive content. And there are places you can go, like Diverse Book Finder is a place where you can plug in your books that are in your classroom or your school library, and it will give you a readout. And it will allow you to determine whether or not the books you have are sensitive and accurate. I believe what Kwame Alexander said: if you want your kids to imagine a better world, the books on your shelves should reflect that.
I would say rethink the curriculum. I'm responsible for creating my own curriculum in my school, so I don't really have that much pushback. But what I would say is it's fun creating something and teaching something that you created. And so if you do have to stick to certain topics, like Jornea said earlier, what was the African-American experience? What were Black people doing at that time? So even if you're going to talk about Henry Ford and the Model T or the assembly line, just think about, well, how much were African-Americans getting paid? What did that look like? How did segregation impact where they lived during that time? And then even, you could go deep further into the communities. So what I would say is just rethink your curriculum, have fun with it. If you can't change everything, change something, make it meaningful.
And my final comments are two parts. One is, because some folks put it in the chat, Jornea is doing that group. I think it's important to recognize that you don't have to engage in this work in isolation. It reminds me of one of my favorite proverbs. I will share with you all. If you want to go fast, go alone. You want to go far, go together. I think it's important for us to be in a position to support each other's growth, to hold each other accountable. I'll stress that accountability should not be punitive. The accountability is for growth and progress. And you don't have to do it in isolation. And in fact, if you're going to work your way through that series of lessons that we designed, I wouldn't do it in isolation, because that's how you can begin to unpack your own thinking and engage in meaningful conversations with those that are participating in that journey with you. And then to Yaritza's point, I would encourage all of you to be very intentional in disrupting a standardized curriculum. Don't wait until February for Black History. Don't wait until March for Women's History. Be intentional. Even if you have to do something that you say for next school year, the second week of September, I'm going to ensure that I'm incorporating Black voices. The third week, I'm going to ensure that I'm including women's voices. The fourth week, I'm going to ensure that I'm including Indigenous voices, and do that throughout the whole school year. And what you will find is the more you normalize that, the more it becomes normal. And therefore it doesn't, when you get to things like February, it turns into a celebration and an accumulation of what you've done up to that point. When you get to March, it turns into a celebration and accumulation of what you've already done. It doesn't become this isolated one-off of the curriculum that diminishes the importance and marginalizes the value.
Absolutely. And so I'm going to leave off with Keila's last paragraph. Even as movements build and some things improve, racist systems and practices persist. We must continue to work together to stop discrimination by getting to know people who are different from us, practicing being a good neighbor and speaking up when we see injustice. And with that being said, we know our mission at Flipgrid is to empower every learner to share their voice and also to respect the diverse voices of others. So I charge all of you to go out and empower every voice in the most beautiful ways. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.